He had power, money, and Manhattan at his feet, until a waitress spilled coffee on his suit and walked straight into his heart. But just when she started to trust him, her sister was dying and she disappeared without a word. What happened next made headlines. What he gave up to bring her back, no one saw coming. Stay with us. This isn't just a love story. It's about grief, sacrifice, and what love really means when everything else is gone. The city pulsed beneath the early morning haze, a quiet symphony of motion and momentum, just beginning to rise with the sun. Manhattan, always just a breath away from chaos, was already stirring to life. Horns blared in distant fits, feet tapped across sidewalks in rhythm, and coffee cups steamed in the hands of the tired and the tireless. Grace Bennett moved through it all like she belonged to the city's heartbeat, yet never quite in sync with its rhythm. Her worn bicycle squeaked with every turn of the pedals, protesting under the weight of a battered front basket that held 2 steaming lattes and a paper bag of muffins. A brown delivery apron flapped behind her as she dodged a taxi door that opened too fast and a businessman too engrossed in his phone to look up. She didn't yell. She didn't even flinch. She just kept pedaling, because time was never on her side. She worked for a small corner cafe on East 34th called Brew and Bloom. The kind of place that survived, not on location or trend, but on soul. Grace wasn't supposed to be out making deliveries, but when the morning shift barista called in sick, she volunteered. Not because she had extra time, she never did, but because the tips from deliveries sometimes meant the difference between her sister Lily getting her next dose of medication or waiting a week too long. The lattes were for a corporate office in Midtown. The client had requested no delays. But Manhattan didn't make promises like that. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was from Lily. You okay? Don't forget breakfast. Grace smiled and glanced at the time. She'd already missed the window to call before school. The guilt sat heavy, as it always did. Her 17-year-old sister was battling a rare autoimmune disease that had left her more familiar with IV poles and beeping monitors than with parties or prom dresses. But Lily never complained. She joked. She encouraged. She lived with a bravery Grace admired more than anyone, and Grace, for her part, survived. She dodged around a sanitation truck and pushed harder, the city wind lifting strands of her curly brown hair from her face. She wore no makeup, and her eyes were shadowed from too many nights spent worrying instead of sleeping. But there was a quiet resilience in the way her jaw tightened, in the way her hands gripped the handlebars. She was small, maybe too small, for the burden life had given her, but she carried it anyway. Up ahead, the light turned yellow. She was 2 blocks away. She didn't see the man step off the curb until it was too late. Her brakes shrieked against the metal. Her tires skidded. The basket lurched. And then, with a spray of hot liquid and a muffled gasp, both lattes catapulted into the air and landed squarely on the chest of a man in a stark white suit. Everything froze. Grace stared in horror as coffee soaked through layers of crisp, expensive fabric. The man didn't move right away. He simply looked down at the damage, a hand slowly rising to brush at the stain. Then he lifted his gaze to her eyes like ice water, piercing and glacial. The world around them kept moving, pedestrians passing, horns honking but for a few seconds. Grace and the man with the ruined suit were locked in a quiet standoff. I'm so sorry, she stammered, climbing off the bike and reaching for the tissue in her pocket. I didn't see why I was rushing, but I'll pay for it. I swear. He said nothing. Not at first. His face was sculpted and still. The kind of face that could have graced a magazine or a courtroom, and never looked out of place in either. His jaw tightened, but his voice when it finally came was low and unmistakably dangerous. Do you often throw coffee at strangers, or am I just the lucky one today? Grace blinked. Excuse me. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his shoes somehow still shining despite the spill. I've seen this trick before. Spill something, apologize profusely, strike up a conversation, maybe hand over a resume. Bold strategy, points for creativity. The insult hit harder than it should have. Grace's mouth opened in disbelief. You think I did this on purpose? She shot back. You think I have time to chase down Wall Street men in white suits and throw drinks at them for fun? He folded his arms, unimpressed. Stranger things have happened. She straightened, shoulders stiff. And what? You're so important people are dying to meet you over a coffee disaster. Statistically speaking, he said dryly. Yes. A few people nearby paused, sensing the tension like electricity in the air. Grace's cheeks flushed, but not from embarrassment. "For the record, I have zero interest in knowing your name, your title, or how many digits are in your bank account. I have a job. I was doing it until you stepped out like you owned the crosswalk. I do own the building next to it." Of course he did. She rolled her eyes and turned to pick up the fallen bag of muffins, now crushed and soaked through. "Well, congrats. If you ever need someone to mop your floors, I'd suggest someone with better aim." The edge of his mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly. Not quite a smile, not quite mockery, but close. She didn't wait for more. She grabbed her bike and began to walk it away, boots squelching slightly with each step. Behind her, the man watched, his eyes lingering longer than logic would allow. Lucas Thorne hadn't intended to be on the street that morning. His driver was late. His phone call had ended early. He'd needed the air, though he would never admit that he had felt something hollow in his chest when he woke up alone in his 50th floor penthouse. He had everything. At least, that's what the magazines said. Thorne Properties, Manhattan's premier luxury developer, a Forbes-featured king of concrete, but Lucas felt no thrill in success anymore. Just pressure, expectation, obligation, and now, a stain, a woman with too much fire in her voice, and a question in the back of his mind he couldn't explain. Back at Brew and Bloom, Grace slid behind the counter, her clothes still damp from the splash. Her coworker raised an eyebrow. "Bad delivery. You have no idea." She didn't elaborate. That night, as she tucked Lily in with a container of reheated soup and a soft lullaby, Grace smiled despite the exhaustion. Her life was messy, complicated, but it was hers, and she wouldn't trade it for all the Armani suits in the world. Meanwhile, in a glass tower above the city, Lucas Thorne sat at his desk, staring out over the skyline. The stain on his suit had been professionally cleaned within hours. The fabric looked untouched, but his mind wasn't, because for reasons he couldn't quite name. He was still thinking about the girl with coffee on her hands, fire in her words, and eyes that didn't flinch in front of power. And he couldn't shake the feeling that the collision that morning was only the beginning. The Grand Astoria gleamed like a palace, its chandeliers strung like starlight across an opulent sky. Beneath the vaulted ceilings, the city's elite moved through marble corridors in tailored tuxedos and floor-length gowns, their laughter too polished, their smiles too practiced. It was the kind of evening where wealth pretended to be warmth, where generosity wore a diamond pin. Grace Bennett didn't belong here, and she felt it in every glance that brushed past her. She stood along the edge of the ballroom, dressed in a borrowed black cocktail dress that didn't quite fit. It slipped slightly off one shoulder and clung too tight around her ribs. The name tag pinned to her chest read Volunteer Staff, as if announcing her distance from the glittering crowd. Her hands trembled slightly as she balanced a silver tray, filled with champagne flutes that tinkled when she moved. She had volunteered for the gala 3 weeks earlier when she learned that the hospital overseeing Lily's care, St. Cecilia's, would be one of the night's benefactors. Grace wasn't one to believe in miracles, but she did believe in effort. And if carrying drinks through a room full of billionaires might bring even one new donor to the pediatric ward, then she would serve with a smile. She hadn't expected, however, to feel so invisible, or worse, seen only as a moving fixture like a centerpiece that talked. On the far end of the ballroom, Lucas Thorne stood near a cluster of investors and foundation chairs. He wore a midnight black suit, impeccably tailored, with a crisp white shirt that mirrored the chandeliers above. He looked composed, distant, uninterested in the crowd orbiting him. Cameras occasionally turned in his direction, and he posed when necessary but said little. Across from him, seated at the honorary table, Walter Thorne observed everything. Walter had once built an empire from nothing but land, cement, and ruthless ambition. Now in his late 70s, his eyes had grown sharper even as his spine had begun to curve. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it meant something. Tonight, he watched his grandson as if weighing the last stone in a legacy carefully, built over decades, still not married. He muttered under his breath to the woman beside him, who nodded without looking up. Lucas knew the script. He had lived it for years. His grandfather wanted him to settle down, to anchor the family image with a proper marriage, not for love, for continuity, legacy, appearances. But Lucas had no interest in being a husband. He barely had the capacity for companionship, let alone commitment. It was just after the silent auction ended, when a strange hush swept through the ballroom. A sudden breeze, odd in such a climate-controlled space, passed through the open veranda doors, catching the edge of a decorative tablecloth. In the corner of the room, a candle flickered, then tipped. It happened quickly, too quickly for anyone to process. The edge of the linen ignited, flames licking the tablecloth, curling toward a display of floral arrangements. People screamed, scattering. Glasses shattered. A chorus of nervous gasps erupted. Grace was closest. Without hesitation, she dropped her tray and raced forward. Pulling off her blazer, she smothered the flames, pressing the fabric over the growing fire while others stood, frozen. Her arms burned from the heat, but she didn't stop until the last ember died under the weight of her jacket. Only when the danger passed did anyone move. A wave of applause rippled through the room, hesitant at first, then stronger. Someone offered her a napkin, another handed her a drink, but Grace didn't take anything. Her eyes were drawn downward, where something glinted beneath the charred linens. It was a ring, heavy gold, a crest engraved into its surface an eagle. Mid-flight. She reached for it instinctively, lifting it into the light. Behind her, a cane struck the marble floor with deliberate force. "What's that you're holding?" asked a voice both graveled and commanding. Grace turned slowly. Walter Thorne stood before her. Tall, despite his years, his cane gripped like a scepter. His eyes weren't on her face, they were fixed on the ring in her hand. I found it, she said, on the floor. He stepped closer, then tilted his head, as if appraising her. His gaze flicked to the ring again, then to her soot-streaked dress, and back. Well, he said softly. Then louder, the Thorne family ring. People turned, heads swiveled. The crowd, already primed from the earlier chaos, now drew toward them in curiosity. Lucas, having re-entered the room moments before, stopped in his tracks when he saw his grandfather's expression on Grace, standing beside him, ring in hand. "This," Walter announced, "is fate." Grace blinked. "Excuse me." Walter's eyes gleamed. "She holds the ring. She braved fire without flinching. She saved the night." His voice rose with theatrical flourish. "Ladies and gentlemen, meet my grandson's fiancée." The room gasped. Cameras flashed. Grace dropped the ring. Lucas pushed through the gathering crowd, jaw clenched, the air around him shifting with tension. "Grandfather," he said quietly. "It's not." Walter held up a hand. "Don't embarrass me, Lucas. Not tonight." "She just picked it up," Lucas said, barely containing his frustration. "There's nothing." Walter turned to him slowly. "She risked herself. She wears the ring, and she has more courage in one moment than most of these people show in a lifetime. You should be so lucky." Lucas looked at Grace, who stared at him like he was part of a hallucination. Her eyes were wide, bewildered. She shook her head, lips forming the word no silently. The room had gone still, listening, and Lucas understood, saying no now, denying the claim, would embarrass his grandfather in front of the entire city's philanthropic elite. It would turn an already difficult man into an impossible one, and for reasons he didn't fully understand, Lucas wasn't ready to let that happen. So instead, he turned to the crowd, voice low but deliberate. "She's right," he said. "She found the ring, but more than that, she has my respect, and she has my answer." He bent, picked up the ring from the floor, and reached for Grace's hand. She pulled it back instinctively, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Don't trust me," he murmured so only she could hear. "Just go along with it. I'll explain later." "Go along with what?" she hissed. "You just announced to a room of reporters that we're engaged." Lucas didn't respond. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and as the press erupted into a frenzy of questions and flashes, he forced the barest smile and held her hand high. Grace stood frozen, her body rigid as applause echoed across the ballroom. To the outside world, it was a fairy tale, a heroic girl, plucked from obscurity and crowned by fate. But inside, Grace felt like she was drowning in someone else's story. When the gala finally ended, and the crowd had filtered into the velvet night, Lucas pulled her aside into a quiet corridor behind the main hall. "This isn't real," he said quickly. "It wasn't planned. I'll fix it." Grace's voice cracked with disbelief. "Fix it? You just let your grandfather announce our engagement, and you slid a ring on my finger. Fix what, exactly? The headlines? Or the fact that you've hijacked my life?" Lucas rubbed his forehead. "You don't understand what he's like. If I corrected him in public," she cut him off, "then you should have had the spine to do it anyway." He met her glare with an expression that wasn't anger, but something close to shame. "Look," he said at last, "I'll speak to my team. We'll figure out how to spin this down. Just stay quiet for now." "Stay quiet," Grace echoed. "You want me to just disappear while the media makes up fairy tales about a coffee girl and a billionaire?" Lucas nodded once. "Exactly." Grace drew a long breath, then shoved past him, her heels clicking sharply on the marble. She didn't speak again that night, but as she slipped into a subway car still glowing from the day's chaos, she stared at the ring on her finger. It was too large, heavy, foreign. It didn't belong to her, and yet, somehow, the whole world had already decided it did. The sky over Manhattan had turned sullen with rain. Outside Brew Bloom Cafe, the street glistened with puddles and tire tracks, and the city's usual urgency had slowed under the press of drizzle. Grace Bennett stood behind the counter with a rag in hand, scrubbing away at a coffee stain that wouldn't lift an oddly fitting metaphor for her current situation. She had barely slept since the gala. 3 nights had passed since Walter Thorne had declared her Lucas's fiancée to an audience of donors, reporters, and socialites. 3 nights since Lucas had slipped that ring onto her hand with a warning in his eyes. She'd returned home to a tidal wave of confusion and online speculation, her inbox filled with requests for interviews, her social media flooded with friend requests from strangers and journalists alike. She had turned off her phone, but turning off her thoughts, that had been impossible. Grace had gone to the hospital the morning after the gala, hoping to lose herself in Lily's world for a few hours. Her sister had laughed when she heard the story, half amused, half bewildered. "You're engaged to Lucas Thorne?" Lily grinned. "Do you get a private helicopter now, or just a golden coffee machine?" Grace had tried to laugh with her, but she'd felt the tension lodged deep behind her ribs. The whole thing was absurd. A mistake, a performance she'd never auditioned for. And yet, the ring remained on her finger. No matter how many times she promised herself she would return it. That afternoon, as she wiped the cafe counter in silence, the bell over the door chimed. Grace looked up and froze. Lucas Thorne stood in the doorway, dressed in a dark grey suit that glistened with rain. His presence sucked the air from the room. The few customers inside quieted instinctively. He stepped inside without removing his coat. His blue eyes met hers, unreadable. "You," Grace said, the cloth in her hand tightening. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said, already moving toward the back of the shop. "I have nothing to say to you." Lucas didn't respond. He moved past the espresso machine, ignoring the curious glances of the barista on duty, and waited behind the divider wall that separated the front from the kitchen. Grace joined him reluctantly. Her voice was low but sharp. "You shouldn't have come here. I couldn't do this over a phone call." "Do what? Propose again? Or explain why every major paper still thinks we're planning a fall wedding?" Lucas studied her. Her hair was slightly damp, pulled into a haphazard bun, her apron dotted with espresso stains. There was a strength to her stance, but it was clear she hadn't had time to rest. "My grandfather is thrilled," he said finally. "He's already called half our board. He wants the engagement announced formally next week." Grace's laugh came out bitter and dry. "Well, you should have picked a better actress." "I didn't choose you," Lucas said calmly. "Fate did. Don't you dare romanticize this," she snapped. "You're the one who went along with the lie." "I know," he replied. "And now I'm here to offer you a solution." Grace crossed her arms. "Oh, this'll be good. I'll pay for your sister's treatment. All of it. The surgery, the meds, post-care, private hospital, room, whatever she needs." Her body went rigid. "In return," Lucas continued, "you and I get married for 6 months, just until my grandfather..." He hesitated. "Until the media moves on and the company stabilizes. After that, you walk away, debt-free, anonymous, no questions asked." The offer hung in the air like smoke. Grace blinked. "You're serious?" Lucas nodded once. "Dead serious." She turned her face away, her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "I'm not for sale," she said. "No," Lucas said quietly, "but you are out of options." That was when the anger rose, hot, immediate. She stepped closer, jabbing a finger at his chest. "Don't you dare come in here with your suit and your money and pretend you know what my options are. You don't know what it's like to beg a hospital administrator for mercy. You don't know what it feels like to wake up every day terrified your sister might not make it to next month." Lucas didn't flinch. "You're right," he said. "I don't know what that's like, but I do know what I can do to fix it. I don't want your fixes, she hissed. Then walk away, he said flatly, and risk her treatment being delayed indefinitely. That's your choice. Grace stared at him, her breathing shallow. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you a deal. She turned and walked away without another word, her steps loud against the tile floor. Lucas watched her go, his face unreadable. But the next morning, everything changed. Grace arrived at St. Cecilia's just after sunrise, carrying a thermos of tea and a crossword puzzle book for Lily. As she stepped into the hallway, a nurse she recognized gave her an apologetic smile. Ms. Bennet, Dr. Green asked to speak with you. In the consultation room, the doctor's face was grave. I'm afraid we've had to postpone Lily's scheduled surgery. Grace's hands trembled. What? Why? Our charitable funding allocation was revoked yesterday, he said carefully. The board had to reassign resources. I'm truly sorry. Grace stared at him, the words echoing in her head like a slow explosion. Revoked, she whispered. But you told me it was approved. You said we were on the calendar. I know, he said, quietly. We were blindsided, too. She left the hospital in a daze, the wind cold against her skin despite the summer air. She made calls, she sent emails, she reached out to every contact she had, begging for help. But by the end of the day, the answers were the same. No room, no funding, no solution. That night, Grace sat by Lily's bedside and watched her sleep. Her sister looked impossibly young, cheeks pale, hands limp against the sheets. There was a scar along her forearm from her last procedure, a cruel reminder of how much she had endured. Grace held her hand and whispered into the stillness, I'll find a way, I promise. But as the moon rose and the night deepened, that promise began to feel hollow. The next morning, Lucas returned. He walked into Brew and Bloom as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis the night before. His coat was dry, his eyes steady. In his hand, he carried a folder thick, crisp, stamped with the King Enterprises seal. Grace saw him and froze. What now? She said flatly. He placed the folder on the counter and opened it. Inside was a contract. Your sister gets the surgery, he said. Immediately, signed, funded, guaranteed. She didn't touch the folder. Let me guess, she said. You pulled the funding yesterday, didn't you? Just to corner me. Lucas didn't deny it. Grace laughed a broken, furious sound. You're sick, she said. Manipulating someone's life like it's a chessboard. I'm trying to give you control, he said. You don't know the first thing about control, she shot back. You stand there with your money and your smug little contract and expect people to be grateful for your manipulation. I expect them to survive. Grace's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. She looked down at the paper, her hands clenched into fists. And if I say no, then Lily doesn't get the surgery. Not in time. Her throat tightened. Lucas leaned in slightly, his voice lower now. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to help me finish something. And in return, you get to save your sister's life. Grace stared at him for a long time. Then, slowly, she picked up the pen. Her hand shook as she signed her name. When she looked up, her voice was steel. I'll marry you, but I swear, Lucas Thorne, you will regret dragging me into this. Lucas didn't reply. He simply closed the folder, tucked it under his arm, and walked out into the rain. 3 days later, the wedding was held at the Thorne family estate. It was beautiful, grand, impossibly cold. Grace wore a couture gown she didn't choose, stood under a chandelier she couldn't name, and exchanged vows she didn't write. The press called it a dream. Grace called it survival. And as Lucas placed the ring back onto her finger, her lips curved into a practiced smile for the crowd, but her eyes never met his, because this wasn't a love story. Not yet. The penthouse atop Thorne Tower was a cathedral of glass and silence, perched above Manhattan. It offered a commanding view of the city's endless sprawl. Skyscrapers pierced the skyline like iron needles, and far below, the chaos of streets and lives continued in miniature. But up here, sound was absorbed by the expensive rugs and the thick walls. Nothing echoed. Nothing grew. Grace Bennet stood at the threshold of her new life, clutching the strap of her canvas bag like a lifeline. The marble floors gleamed beneath her feet. The walls were bare, except for a few curated pieces of abstract art, and the lighting cast everything in a soft, impersonal glow. This wasn't a home. It was a showroom. Lucas walked ahead of her without looking back. He wore the suit he had been married in just hours earlier, but the tie was gone. and his posture had shifted, less formal, more exhausted. He paused at the foot of a curved staircase, gesturing up toward the second floor. "Your room is upstairs. Third door on the left," he said, his tone brisk. "I'm rarely home, so make yourself comfortable, within reason." Grace didn't respond. She was still wearing the wedding gown, a custom Parisian piece that had fit her body like it had been designed to cage her in silk. She wanted it off. She wanted to scrub her skin clean. But more than anything, she wanted to breathe in a place that didn't smell like cold air and power. She climbed the stairs in silence and found the room. It was larger than her entire apartment back in Brooklyn. A king-sized bed sat beneath a wall of windows. The bedding was cream and charcoal, the furniture modern and sleek. It looked untouched, as if no one had ever slept here before. She dropped her bag on the floor, stepped out of the gown, and changed into the worn cotton pajamas she'd brought in the bottom of her backpack. They were old and soft, and smelled faintly of the cafe. It was the only part of her that felt real anymore. In the days that followed, Grace kept to herself. She rose early, long before Lucas stirred. If he was even home, and wandered the vast halls like a ghost. She explored quietly, not because she was curious, but because standing still felt unbearable. One morning, after a week of pretending not to exist, she found a narrow door tucked between two tall bookshelves in the library. It led to a stairwell, and the stairwell led to the rooftop. The first time she stepped out, her breath caught. The rooftop garden was long forgotten. Planters were cracked and half empty, vines had withered, and wild weeds spilled over the edges of rusting flower beds. But despite the neglect, the space still breathed. There was a faint hint of lavender in the air. A wind chime clinked in the breeze, tangled in ivy. Grace stood among the ruins of it and whispered aloud, "Looks like me." Tossed aside, but still here. She returned the next morning with a trowel she found in a storage closet. Then again the next day with a pair of gloves. She didn't tell anyone. It became her sanctuary. The one place in the tower, untouched by Lucas's world. She began weeding, trimming, repotting. She found a few stubborn herbs that had clung to lifetime. Mintand whispered encouragement as she revived them. Sometimes she sang, softly, not for anyone else, but to fill the silence that had begun to scrape at the edges of her thoughts. Unbeknownst to her, Lucas noticed. He came home later than usual one evening and caught the faint sound of a melody through the rooftop vent. He didn't recognize the song, but her voice, clear and haunting, made him pause in the middle of his study. He stood there for a long moment, listening, then turned away before the warmth that stirred in his chest could solidify into anything dangerous. Inside the apartment, Grace established a quiet routine. She began cooking small meals for herself in the expansive, unused kitchen. She made soups and omelettes, tomato toast with rosemary. It felt strange at first to use state-of-the-art appliances to make such humble dishes, but she refused to pretend she was something she wasn't. She never asked if Lucas wanted any, but she began leaving an extra plate on the counter, just in case. At first he ignored them. Then, one night, he came home well past midnight and found a still warm dish of potato leek soup covered in foil. He ate it standing at the counter, slowly, staring out at the skyline. He never thanked her. She never asked him to. Still, the food kept appearing, and so he started coming home earlier. But if the distance between them began to shift in small, quiet ways, neither of them acknowledged it. They continued to pass each other like satellites circling the same center, but never colliding, until the night of the dinner party. It was one of those social events that filled Lucas's calendar like a sickness. A private evening hosted by a business partner, filled with champagne and curated laughter. The kind of gathering where alliances were built over wine and casual cruelty. Walter had insisted Grace attend. "She's your wife," he'd said sternly. "She has a role to play." So she had dressed, in an emerald green gown sent over by Walter's assistant. The fabric was soft and light, the color rich against her skin. For the first time since the wedding, she looked at her reflection and didn't flinch. She looked beautiful, powerful, untouchable, a lie in silk. They arrived together. Lucas, ever immaculate. Grace, unreadable behind her practiced smile. The penthouse where the dinner was hosted belonged to a man named Hartmann, long-time investor with a fondness for Bordeaux and crude jokes. The room buzzed with chatter, music, and the scent of rare beef. Grace stayed near the buffet, sipping orange juice and observing. She felt like a guest in a world that refused to acknowledge her, and yet couldn't take its eyes off her. She spotted Lucas across the room, laughing with a group of men in tuxedos. One of them, tall, broad, with too much cologne, clapped him on the back and said something that made the group burst into laughter. Grace wasn't trying to listen, but the breeze from a sliding door carried the words across the room like a knife. "So, this reluctant wife of yours, still playing house?" Lucas lifted his glass, smirking. "She's just a performance. Lowly girl who thinks proximity equals belonging." The laughter that followed was cruel. Grace didn't move, not at first. She just stood there, still as stone, the flute of orange juice trembling in her hand. Lowly performance proximity. She turned and left the room without a word. No one noticed, not even Lucas. Outside the air was cold. Her gown fluttered behind her as she walked down a side street, heels clicking against pavement, heart beating so loudly she could barely hear anything else. She didn't cry, not right away, but when she found a bench on the edge of the park and sat down beneath a bare-limbed tree, the first tear broke free, then another. She told herself not to feel this way, that she didn't care, that it didn't matter what Luke Thorne thought of her, but it did, because she had offered him quiet, gestures, meals, smiles, space, humanity, and he had offered her mockery. She returned to the penthouse long after midnight. The lights were off. Lucas was nowhere in sight. The garden sat in darkness, the herbs she had nurtured swaying gently in the wind. She stood there for a long time, her fists clenched at her sides. Then she turned, walked to her room, and began packing. The next morning, Lucas found the kitchen empty. No breakfast, no warmth, no trace of her usual morning cinnamon and black coffee. He checked her room. She was gone. Her bag, her books, even her slippers had vanished. Only the ring remained, placed neatly on his desk, and in that moment, as the silence wrapped around him like a noose, Lucas realized something he had not expected. He missed her, not the presence, not the performance. Her, the girl who had dared to plant flowers in his concrete world, and he had destroyed it, all of it. The silence in the penthouse was different now. It wasn't the usual stillness that came with wealth and heights, and composed, like glass poised on the edge of shattering. This silence was heavy, almost animate. It filled the hallways, hovered in corners, sat in rooms like an unwelcome guest, refusing to leave. Lucas Thorne stood in the middle of his living room at dusk, still dressed from the office, but without any memory of what he had worked on that day. The city lights blinked beyond the glass, and below, Manhattan roared on, oblivious to the fact that the woman who had made this place feel almost human was gone. He hadn't known she'd left until hours after the party. He'd returned late that night, expecting her to be in her room, maybe silent, maybe angry, but still there. She wasn't. Her door was open. The bed was made. The wardrobe stood bare. Her canvas bag, the one with frayed straps and a keychain shaped like a sunflower, was missing. Only the ring lay behind, placed with quiet finality on the surface of his desk. It caught the moonlight like it had once caught headlines. Lucas had stared at it for a long time, something sharp and unfamiliar stirring beneath his ribs. He hadn't realized until then how many signs she had given him, how many silent offerings, how many attempts to build something in a place where nothing had ever grown. The meals, the garden, the soft humming in the kitchen when she thought no one was listening, and he had ruined it with one sentence, lowly, that had come so easily, casually, like a weapon drawn by instinct. He hadn't meant it, not really. He had been tired, cornered, surrounded by men who measured worth in status and women in compliance. He had performed just as much as she had, but his performance had wounded, and her absence made him realize how much her presence had mattered. He wandered into the kitchen and stood in front of the empty counter. No soup, no scent of rosemary, no mismatched mugs left out from her late-night tea. He walked to the rooftop and found the garden untouched since her last day there. The herbs drooped unwatered. The mint had begun to yellow. She had kept this place alive, and now it was wilting without her. The next morning, Lucas did something he hadn't done in years. He took the day off. His assistant was stunned. "But the Zurich call, reschedule," he said, hanging up before she could argue. He went first to the cafe. Grace wasn't there. The manager told him she hadn't been seen in days. The woman's expression was cautious, curious, but not surprised. Lucas left without answering the unspoken questions in her eyes. He went to St. Cecilia's next. Lily's room was empty. A nurse told him Grace had transferred her sister's care to a facility in Vermont. It was the only lead he had. Lucas drove out that same afternoon. The further he got from the city, the more the world seemed to shift. The air grew clearer, the skyline softened into hills, and the noise he'd carried inside his chest began to dissolve, replaced by a strange, persistent ache. It was past midnight when he pulled into the gravel lot of a small roadside inn. The wooden sign above the office read Brattleboro Pines Rooms by the night or week. A single lamp glowed in the window. He parked, climbed out, and leaned against the car for a long moment, unsure what he was even doing. Apologies were not his. Language, vulnerability had never served him in business or in life, but none of that mattered now. He had lost her, and if he didn't try to find her again, he would lose a part of himself he hadn't even known existed. The next morning, he walked the town. Brattleboro was quiet, charming in a way he had never noticed before. The sidewalks were uneven, the cafes were painted in cheerful pastels, and people actually made eye contact when they passed you. He stopped at a florist, then a diner. No one recognized the name Grace Bennett. Then, near the edge of town, he saw her, through a fogged-up window of a place called Mama's Kitchen. She stood behind a counter, wiping down menus with quiet focus. Her hair was pulled into a loose braid, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. She wore an apron that didn't match, and the shadows beneath her eyes were deeper than he remembered. She looked tired, she looked real, and she looked like home. Lucas stepped inside. The bell over the door jingled, and Grace looked up. Their eyes met. She froze. He did not move any closer. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The other customers in the diner continued sipping coffee, unaware that something monumental had shifted in the air between two people who had once shared a world that was neither theirs nor safe. Grace set down the menu she had been cleaning and walked out from behind the counter. Her voice was low, steady, but her hands were trembling. "What are you doing here?" Lucas swallowed, searching for the words he had rehearsed a dozen times on the drive up. "I came to apologize." Her expression didn't change. "I came because I hurt you," he continued. "Because I was arrogant. Because I was cruel. Because I thought the only way to survive was to keep everything and everyone at arm's length. And because you made me see how wrong I was." Grace didn't respond. "I didn't mean what I said at the party," he said, "but that doesn't excuse it, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to hear that I know I failed you." He took a breath, then did something no one in the diner could have anticipated. He dropped to his knees. The diner went quiet. Forks paused mid-air. A mother pulled her child closer. Lucas didn't care. "I miss you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I miss your voice in the kitchen. I miss the garden. I miss the soup you left out without asking. I miss how you made my home feel less like a museum and more like something alive." Grace's throat tightened. She stared down at the man she had once believed incapable of admitting fault. The man who had brought her into a cold world and let her bleed there. And now he was kneeling in a Vermont diner, broken open in front of strangers, but her walls didn't drop. "Not yet. Go back to Manhattan," she said softly. "That world suits you. I don't." Lucas looked up at her. "That world means nothing without you in it." But she shook her head and walked away, disappearing into the kitchen, her braids swinging behind her like a curtain. He didn't follow. Instead, he stood slowly, brushing off his knees, and left without another word. But he didn't go back to the city. He found a room at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town and began showing up at the diner every morning. He didn't ask to see her. He just worked washing dishes, wiping tables, hauling crates for deliveries. He showed up early, stayed late, never complained. Grace ignored him at first. Then, reluctantly, she began to notice the way he didn't act, like a man trying to prove a point. He acted like a man trying to atone. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't call his assistant. He didn't flaunt his name. He just stayed. The days stretched on, slow and strange. And one afternoon, when Grace returned home with aching feet and a headache blooming behind her eyes, she found a small white bag sitting on the porch. Inside was a bottle of her favorite ginger lemon tea and a single handwritten note. "You don't have to say anything. I just hope you're okay." She didn't cry, but she sat on the steps until the sun went down, the note still clutched in her hand. Lucas stayed through the fall, through the rainstorms, through the quiet mornings, through the awkward silences that gradually gave way. 2 nods, then to small talk. And though she hadn't forgiven him, not yet, something in Grace softened, because this man, the one who had once stood so far above her, was now choosing to stand beside her. And for the first time, he wasn't asking her to meet him in his world. He was learning how to live in hers. By the time the first snow fell in Brattleboro, the town had already grown used to the quiet presence of Lucas Thorne. He no longer drew curious stares when he passed through the town square in worn jeans and a flannel jacket. He was no longer just the outsider with polished shoes and polished lies. People still didn't quite know what to make of him, but they saw the way he moved, measured, humbled, as if carrying something invisible on his shoulders. Grace, too, noticed the difference. Not in what he said, because he still said very little, but in what he no longer needed to say. Every morning, he showed up at Mama's kitchen before sunrise. He restocked the fridge, repaired the leaky sink, helped old Mr. Henley push his wheelchair up the ramp. He cooked when short-staffed. He waited tables when the high schoolers didn't show. He wiped down booths like he wasn't the man whose name had once been printed on the side of Manhattan's tallest tower. Grace hadn't invited him, and she hadn't told him to leave. They existed side by side, tentatively, wordlessly, like 2 puzzle pieces that had once fit poorly, but were now reshaping their edges. One Sunday, just before closing, she caught him humming to himself while washing dishes. It was off-key, something old and familiar. She paused near the doorframe, arms crossed, hiding the smile before it reached her mouth. "You sing now?" she asked, surprising even herself. Lucas looked over, suds on his forearms, hair mussed from a long shift. He offered a sheepish grin, one of the few she'd ever seen on him. "Apparently," he said, "I'm discovering all kinds of skills I never needed on the 92nd floor." She shook her head, hiding her laugh behind her sleeve. The conversation didn't go further. It didn't need to. The silence between them had changed. It no longer bristled with tension. It carried weight, yes, but also possibility. Later that night, as snow powdered the windows and the last customer shuffled out, Grace sat alone at the corner table, staring at her notebook. It was filled with numbers, plans, dreams she had once scribbled in the margins of her life back in Brooklyn. Lucas passed by with a tray, then paused. "What are you working on?" he asked. She hesitated, unsure why the question made her breath catch. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about starting something of my own. Not just the diner, something warmer, brighter, a place that feels like a little piece of hope." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "What would it be?" She looked up, her eyes lit, just a little. "A cafe, but not like the ones in Manhattan with cold marble tables and $12 lattes. Something with books and plants and music. Something that feels like ... me." Lucas didn't speak right away, but when he did, his voice was different, lower, earnest. "I think people would line up for a place like that." She studied him. No sarcasm, no strategic tilt to his words, just belief. It startled her more than any apology ever had. Over the next few weeks, he asked questions not to intrude, but to understand. What did she envision? What colors? What menu? Would she serve herbal tea? Would she include community poetry nights? And Grace, reluctant at first, began to open. Her eyes sparkled when she spoke about cinnamon scones and lavender lattes, about hosting live music from local bands, about shelves of second-hand books people could read and leave behind. Lucas offered to help, not with money, not with control, but with quiet support. Legal paperwork, vendor research, zoning laws. "I won't touch the design," he promised, as they walked together down Main Street after closing one night. "This has to be yours." She looked at him under the dim glow of his street lamp. Snow clung to his shoulders, softened the hard lines of his face. "You've changed," she said quietly. He didn't answer right away. Then, "No, I'm just becoming the man I should have been all along." They reached the corner where the old bookstore had closed months earlier. She stopped, looked up at the faded windows and the for lease sign. Lucas followed her gaze. "This, the one?" She nodded. "It's nothing fancy," she said, suddenly uncertain. "It needs repairs. The wiring's old. The rent's probably high." "I'll take care of the lease," he interrupted gently. "No strings, just let me help you build the place you are always meant to run." Her breath caught. "Lucas." "Grace," he said, meeting her eyes. "Please." She didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. They stood together, in the snow, not touching, not speaking, but something unspoken passed between them. A seed of forgiveness not yet a bloom, but a root, and slowly, day by day, the cafe began to take form. They cleaned the space together. She painted the walls, in shades of sunflower and honey. He built the shelves with his own hands, leaving fingerprints in the wood. She picked out second-hand furniture with mismatched charm. He rewired the lights. They laughed, sometimes awkward, hesitant laughs that turned real before either of them noticed. One morning, while sanding an old table, Lucas glanced over and saw Grace brushing sawdust from her cheek. She looked up, and for a second, the world fell still. There was no Manhattan, no headlines, no betrayal, only two people, trying to build something that had never been given to them before. Grace cleared her throat, looked away. Don't fall in love with the cafe before it's even got a name. Lucas smiled, small and true. Late. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Grace froze, then turned, paintbrush in hand, and walked to the other side of the room. She didn't say anything, but her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the next can of paint. That night, when Lucas returned to the inn, he sat at the edge of his bed, thinking about what he had said. Too late. And it was true. He loved her, not for how she made him feel, or what she had done for him, but for the strength in her silences. The gentleness she never flaunted, the way she saw beauty in broken furniture, in failing gardens, in men like him who had never been taught how to love anything but ambition. He knew he didn't deserve her, but he was willing to earn the right to stay by her side, and maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to believe it too, because the next morning, when he arrived at the cafe, he found her waiting at the front door, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without a word, then smiled, and Lucas, Thorne, once the coldest man in Manhattan, felt the warmth of something he'd never known before. Hope. The first morning, the Sunflower and Steam Cafe opened its doors to the public. It was still dark outside. Snow had fallen overnight, dusting the sidewalks and windowsills in soft white. But inside the little shop on the corner of Main and Rose, light spilled from the windows like warmth finally given form. Grace stood behind the counter, her apron still stiff from its first wash, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the chalkboard menu for the 4th time. She'd written every word by hand, looping the letters like she had in the notes she used to leave Lily back in their tiny Brooklyn apartment. Lucas was nearby, aligning chairs and sweeping away the last traces of plaster dust. He hadn't slept much, but there was something in his face, softened open, that suggested he didn't mind. He caught her glancing at him and grinned without saying a word. Neither of them needed to speak. Not that morning. By 8 a.m., the first customer came in, a woman with graying curls and a cane who simply said, "Smells like a real place in here." Grace gave her a muffin on the house. Lucas held the door open as she left, whispering, "Tell your friends." And she did. Within a week, Sunflower and Steam was buzzing. Locals dropped by 4 scones and slow-brewed coffee. Artists came in with sketchpads. Teachers brought students after school for cookies. There were shelves of books with dog-eared pages and notes. In the margins, fairy lights strung along the windows flickered softly at night, glowing like stars that had decided to come indoors for a while. Grace had created something she had never truly known before, a place where people came not to escape their lives, but to feel them more deeply. Lucas became part of the rhythm, not just as a helper or silent investor, but as a man who belonged. He repaired what broke, brewed what was needed, and took quiet joy in watching. Grace moved through the space she had once only dared to imagine, but something deeper shifted that. Second week, when a visitor arrived Grace had not expected. Elliot Ford. He stepped into the cafe one rainy afternoon, shaking off his coat, his polished shoes tracking droplets across the floor. His presence immediately drew glances. Tall, handsome, and familiar with the kind of attention that follows confidence. Elliot looked entirely out of place among mismatched chairs and tea-stained menus. Grace looked up from the counter and froze. "Elliot," she said carefully, her smile polite but wary. "Couldn't stay away," he said with his usual charm. "I heard rumors of a cafe making headlines in Brattleboro. Didn't expect to find you behind it." Lucas, watching from the register, didn't move. He didn't speak, but something cold flickered across his features. Grace stepped around the counter. "What brings you all the way up here?" "I had business in Montpelier. Thought I'd take a scenic detour." "You've made something beautiful, Grace. This place feels like you. There was something too familiar in the way he said her name, too easy in the way he placed his hand over hers on the countertop. Lucas's jaw tightened. Grace withdrew her hand, stepping back slightly. "Thank you, but I'm sure you didn't drive 2 hours just to compliment my cafe." Elliot laughed. "Fair enough. I actually came to talk about a potential partnership. I've got investors looking to fund boutique spaces like this authentic, grounded, local charm. With the right expansion model, we're not for sale," Lucas said. It was the first time he'd spoken. His voice was even, but edged. Elliot turned. "I don't believe we've met." Lucas offered a tight nod. "We have, briefly, Manhattan, fundraiser for the Foster Youth Initiative. You asked if my name was French." Elliot tilted his head. "Right. Lucas Thorne, the Ice King. Didn't recognize you out of your suit." Lucas stepped closer. "Grace built this place from scratch. It's not a commodity. It's not a brand. And it sure as hell isn't something you can replicate in 10 cities with fake distressed wood and artisan lighting." Grace put a hand gently on Lucas's arm. "Lucas." But he wasn't angry. He was steady. Elliot raised his hands. "No offense meant, just business." He turned back to Grace. "You know where to find me if you ever decide to dream bigger." He left without ordering anything. The silence that followed was sharp. Grace let out a breath, eyes still on the door. "You didn't have to do that." Lucas looked at her, unsure whether she was angry or grateful. "I know." She looked at him then, really looked, and something flickered in her gaze, something like the early edge of a storm or the warmth before a kiss. Later that evening, after they closed, she found Lucas on the back patio, stacking crates. The air was cold. Stars pierced the black sky. She stepped out, wrapped in a cardigan, holding 2 mugs of tea. "I wasn't going to take his offer," she said quietly, handing him one. Lucas accepted it, eyes steady. "I know." They stood there a while, sipping in silence. "I meant what I said," he added. "This cafe is yours, and I'll fight to protect it, even when you don't ask me to." Grace's eyes shimmered in the half-light. "I didn't expect you to stay this long," she said. Lucas looked away, then back. "I didn't expect you to change me." A pause. Then Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out something smaller. Folded napkin, the kind she used to scribble ideas on before the cafe opened. She unfolded it and handed it to him. At the top, in loopy handwriting, was a list of names: Sunbeam and Sugar, Steam and Petal, The Wild Bloom, Sunflower and Steam. Next to the final name, a small heart. Lucas looked up. "That was the first time I let myself imagine you in the future," she said, voice trembling. "I didn't know if you'd ever see it." He didn't speak. Instead, he set down his tea, stepped closer, and wrapped his arms around her, slowly, gently, as if holding something that had taken years to grow. Grace leaned into him without hesitation. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The moment was enough. And in that quiet corner of a snow-covered town, 2 people who had lost themselves in the noise of the world began, finally, to find each other in the quiet. The frost came early that winter, painting the windows of sunflower and steam in delicate filigrees. Inside, the cafe glowed like a sanctuary against the cold strings of golden lights above the counter. Cinnamon-sweet air hanging over customers in knit scarves and worn boots. Grace moved between tables with her usual grace, a quiet energy in her that had become part of the space itself. But that week, something had shifted. Lucas noticed it before she did. A hesitation in her smile. A pause when someone mentioned her sister's name. The way she lingered at the back door in the early mornings, phone in hand, waiting for a call that didn't come. He waited, gave her space. But when he found her, in the storeroom one evening, seated on a crate with her face buried in her hands, he didn't hesitate. "Grace," he said gently. She looked up. Her eyes were red, her shoulders trembling. "They said, the cancer's back," she whispered. "Lily didn't want to tell me until she had the scans confirmed." Lucas didn't speak. He just sat beside her and took her hand. "I thought we had more time," she said. She was doing so well. "She's only 21. The way her voice broke on the word 21 shattered something in him. "She wants to come visit," Grace added. "She says she wants to see the cafe, see me happy. But I know what she's really doing. She's saying goodbye." Lucas swallowed hard. "Then we'll make sure it's a goodbye she'll never forget." That weekend, Grace and Lucas turned the cafe into something out of a dream. They hung paper lanterns from the ceiling. They brought in a piano from the local church and invited musicians. They filled the bookshelves with Lily's favorite titles. They added a corner of sunflowers, even in winter, freshly delivered from a greenhouse outside of town. When Lily arrived, thinner than before but smiling, Grace ran to her, lifting her off her feet in a hug that said everything words couldn't. "I've missed you," Lily whispered. Grace kissed her forehead. "Then you're staying as long as you want." Lily spent her days curled on the cafe's window bench, sketching customers in a small journal. She joked with Lucas, teased Grace, flirted shamelessly with the high school barista. But at night, Grace could hear her coughing. Long, painful spells that left her breathless. Lucas didn't press. He let Grace hold that space for her sister, but he made sure everything else around her was effortless: food stocked, lights fixed, rent paid without her asking, and he began to think about the kind of life they might have if time was cruel. Again. One evening, Grace came home to find a notebook on her bed. It was Lucas's single quotes S. Inside were pages of sketches of the cafe, of her, of Lily laughing at the counter. But it wasn't the drawings that stopped her breath, it was the words. Small paragraphs, raw and uneven, confessions he'd never said aloud. "I used to think power meant control. Now I think it means knowing when to let someone else lead. I was never afraid of losing money. I was terrified of being truly seen. I'm scared I've already ruined this. But if you let me, I'll spend the rest of my life repairing every broken thing you inherited from loving me." She closed the notebook and pressed it to her chest, and wept the next morning. She walked into the cafe early and found him there, sleeves rolled up, repairing a wobbling stool. "You wrote about me," she said softly. Lucas turned. "I did. Why? Didn't you give it to me? I didn't want to put pressure on you. I just needed you to know what's true, even if I never earned the right to say it aloud." She stepped closer. "You earned more than that." Then, before he could respond, she kissed him, not rushed, not hesitant. A kiss of knowing, of choosing, of letting go of all the ghosts that had once stood between them. That night, Grace cooked for the first time in weeks. She and Lily and Lucas sat at the small kitchen table, laughter bouncing off the walls. For a moment, it felt like time had been suspended, like pain had been paused, like the world had been kind. But life has a way of reminding us that it doesn't wait. One afternoon, Lily collapsed at the cafe. Lucas caught her before she hit the floor. Grace screamed. An ambulance came. Hours passed like years. When the doctor stepped into the waiting room, Grace already knew. The treatment wasn't working. The cancer had spread. "They're giving her 6 months. She whispered into Lucas's chest that night. "Maybe less." Lucas held her as she shook. "What if I lose her?" she choked. "What if I lose her before I've really lived anything of my own?" He kissed her temple. "Then let's give her the memory of you living." The next morning, they closed the cafe for a day, hung a sign that said, "Back soon, making memories." They took Lily to the lake, despite the cold, built a fire, roasted marshmallows, sang songs off key. Lily laughed so hard she cried. She made Lucas wear a sunflower crown. She told Grace, "This is the version of you I always believed in." When they got home, Lily handed Grace a folded envelope. "Open it when I'm gone," she said. Grace shook her head. "Don't say that." But Lily smiled, soft and brave. "It's okay. Some things aren't meant to last forever, but that doesn't make them less real." Later that night, Lucas stood on the porch, watching the snow fall. Grace joined him. "She's not afraid," Grace said. "No," Lucas replied. "She's showing us how to live." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "What if we can't go back to normal after this? Then we make a new normal." She looked at him. "Lucas, I love you." He closed his eyes, like the words hit him somewhere nothing else had ever reached. "I love you too," he said. They didn't talk about the future, but in that moment, they finally started building it. The morning of Lily's passing was quiet, not tragic, not violent, just quiet. She had been asleep, her fingers curled gently around Grace's hand, the slightest smile lingering on her lips, as if she had been dreaming of something sweet. The hospital room was filled with morning light, soft and golden, brushing over the worn sketchbook beside her pillow and the sunflower Grace had placed in the vase beside her bed the night before. Grace didn't cry at first. She sat there for a long time, stroking her sister's hair, whispering promises she had once made on rooftops and subway trains, that she would keep going, that she would love bravely, that she would never let the world make her small again. Lucas arrived an hour later. He said nothing, just took one look at Grace, knelt beside her chair, and rested his forehead against her knee. That simple gesture undid her. Not in a way that shattered, but in a way that finally allowed the tears to come. The funeral was held in the meadow just outside Brattleboro, surrounded by early spring wildflowers and the bare beginnings of green returning to the trees. Grace didn't want marble or polished wood or hymns sung out of duty. She wanted Lily to be remembered among life where things grew. People came from everywhere. Regulars from the cafe, doctors from the hospital, high school classmates, even a few artists Lily had followed online who had only met her through the pages of her sketchbook. They left drawings in a basket. Some wrote poems. Others simply stood in silence, holding each other. After the ceremony, Lucas found Grace sitting alone on the bench where they used to drink coffee before opening the cafe. Her eyes were distant, but there was something steady in her now, like the ground beneath her had shifted, but she'd decided not to fall. She would have loved it. She murmured. She did. Lucas said. She loved all of it, especially you. Grace smiled faintly. She saw the version of me I didn't believe could survive. Lucas didn't argue. He didn't tell her she was wrong. He just sat beside her, offering her the warmth of someone who had already chosen to stay. In the weeks that followed, Grace moved slowly. She returned to the cafe in short shifts. Customers brought her notes, flowers, memories of Lily drawn on napkins. Lucas kept everything running. He didn't push, didn't ask for more than she could give. He simply waited. And when she was ready, she took his hand one morning and whispered, "I want to start again." So they did. Together, they repainted the cafe, added a new corner near the windows, a little studio where kids could draw and paint. Grace named it Lily's Light, and soon it became the heart of sunflower and steam, glowing with color and laughter every afternoon. Lucas stayed in Brattleboro officially. He sold the last of his shares in Thorne & Co., walked away from board meetings and skyscrapers and everything he once thought defined him. When asked why, he simply said, "I found something worth staying still for." That spring, on the anniversary of the cafe's opening, he closed the shop early and drove Grace to the old orchard just outside town. The sun was setting, and the sky bled every shade of gold and lavender. Blankets were spread out under a tree blooming with early blossoms. A small radio played something soft and old-fashioned. Grace looked around, puzzled. "What is this?" Lucas took a breath and stepped back. From his pocket, he pulled a small black box. Her heart stopped. He didn't kneel. He didn't need to. Instead, he opened the box slowly, revealing a ring so simple and beautiful it looked like it belonged to someone who believed in beginnings, not fairy tales. "I thought I'd lost everything once," he said. "My mother, my sense of home, myself. But then you spilled coffee on me, and everything I thought I understood about power, about love, about living, began to unravel." Grace's lips trembled. "I don't want to own you. I don't want to fix you or ask you to carry anything more than you already have. I just want to build a life beside you. One morning, one storm, one sunrise at a time." She reached up, touched his face, and whispered, "Yes." They didn't announce it in the newspaper. There was no ballroom, no designer gown. Instead, they married beneath the very same tree, barefoot in the grass, surrounded by wildflowers and old friends and the sound of laughter from the children's corner of the cafe. Walter Thorne came, holding onto his cane, his eyes damp. He kissed Grace's forehead and said, "You brought my grandson home." At the reception, the cake was made by 3 elderly women from the town's knitting club. The music was played by a jazz trio who once performed every Thursday night on the sidewalk outside the bookstore. There were no speeches, only stories, little moments offered like gifts, like proof that real love is made in ordinary hours. And after everyone had gone home, Lucas and Grace returned to the cafe, a single candle on the counter. He turned on the record player. They danced slowly in the quiet, just the two of them, surrounded by the life they had built from broken pieces and second chances. Later, curled together on the window bench, with his jacket wrapped around her shoulders, Grace looked out at the dark street and said, "I used to think love had to hurt to matter." Lucas kissed the top of her head. "And now I think the bravest kind of love is the one that stays, even after everything." He held her tighter. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And he didn't, single quotes TID, in the years that followed. The cafe grew slowly, intentionally. Grace began teaching art classes in the evenings. Lucas volunteered at the local high school, mentoring kids who dreamed bigger than the zip code they were born into. They hosted open mic nights, planted a sunflower garden behind the cafe, and on the 4th spring since Lily passed, they named their first daughter Cecilia Lily Thorne. She had her mother's eyes and her aunt's laugh, and every year, on the anniversary of that first spilled coffee, Grace and Lucas closed the cafe for 1 hour, just long enough to sit at their favorite bench, sip 2 cups of dark roast, and remind each other how it all began, not with perfection, not with a mess, and with the choice, again and again, to stay. Grace Bennett was never meant to collide with Lucas Thorne. She was a small-town girl trying to survive in Manhattan, and he was a cold, powerful CEO who had buried every emotion beneath ambition. But fate has a funny way of working. What began with a spilled cup of coffee turned into something. Neither of them expected: a journey of healing, redemption, and quiet, unconditional love. Through grief, setbacks, and the heartbreaking loss of Grace's sister Lily, their bond was tested again and again. Lucas had to unlearn everything he believed about strength and success, and Grace had to learn that love doesn't mean losing yourself. In the end, they chose each other not out of obligation, but out of resilience, vulnerability, and the kind of love that stays even when things get hard. They built a life not in penthouses, but in a sun-drenched cafe called Sunflower Steam. Together, they planted a life rooted in memory, in hope, and in new beginnings. What made their story extraordinary wasn't perfection, it was the courage to grow through the pain, to love without conditions, and to start again. Life lesson: real love isn't about fairy tale moments or grand gestures. It's about the quiet choices we make every day to stay, to care, and to show up, especially when it's hard. In our own lives, the greatest transformations often begin in the messiest moments. We just have to be willing to open the door. Quiz time. What do you think? Which choice was the turning point in Lucas and Grace's story? A. When Grace left Manhattan to care for Lily. B. When Lucas gave up his company to be with Grace. Comment A or B below. And what about you? What part of this story touched you the most? Share in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to support the channel. Your support keeps us going with more heartwarming stories ahead.